Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte. This is the podcast where we ask the tricky questions about the world around us. I'm George Parrett, and today we're asking, can we finally stop talking about Brexit? Hello everyone, and thank you so much for downloading this week's episode. This week we're talking about the B word, Brexit, as ever I'm with a trusty companion. It's tariff-free Ethan. How are you, Ethan?
Tariff-free, apparently.
Yep, we're back in the studio again, Ethan, and I think last time I saw you, we were dressed up in our penguin suits, weren't we?
Yeah, we were really excited to take home the Silver Award in the Corporate Content Awards for Best Use of Audio. So any first-time listeners, there's an award-winning back catalogue for you to listen to.
That's right, yeah. We're officially an award-winning podcast, and you can find all of our episodes on our webpage, which is deloitte.co.uk/greenroom podcasts. And there's everything there from imposter syndrome to smart cities to mental health issues and all the rest of it. So yeah, do download, give it 5 stars and tell your friends. We're talking about Brexit, and it's a quick question to try you out first off, Ethan. Can you guess how many days it's been since the EU referendum?
It must have been three and a half years, more.
Yeah,
less.
more over 3.5 years. Yeah,
so 1,000 days, something like that.
Yeah, 1,348.5 days I calculated at the time of recording. So 193 weeks, and it's an ongoing discussion really. And I think today hopefully we're going to get into the nitty gritty about what's actually changed in that time and what will change over the coming years. So yeah, hopefully we'll get to the bottom of this week's big question, which is, can we finally stop talking about Brexit? But Ethan, I don't think you and I are equipped enough to do this on our own. So who have we got in the studio to help us?
Yeah, so today we're joined with Amanda Tickel. Amanda leads our Brexit Insights team. She advises businesses on all things Brexit, helping them to understand what the UK's exit from the EU means for them. Hi, Amanda.
Hello.
Hi. And we're also joined with Raoul Ruparel. Raoul is an advisor in our Brexit team. He previously worked as Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on Europe and Special Advisor to the Secretary of State for exiting the EU. Hi, Raoul.
Hi there.
And as ever, we're going to start with our icebreaker. So none of us have seen this question before. I'm going to take it. If you were stranded on a desert island, what one item would you want with you?
Oh, this is a classic question here. I'm probably going to have to say a pub. Yeah, a fully stocked pub. I think that would make a
slightly cheating.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, I'm going to stick by it if that's right.
I mean, if you're allowed to go for a pub, I mean, I'll take a library.
A library, yeah.
I mean, I'm tempted to say something practical like a penknife, but if you're going for a pub, I'll go for a library.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, life's too short, I think. Yeah.
Well, if we've got pubs and libraries, I'm going to take my family.
Oh, that's probably should have done that.
Yeah, I feel terrible now.
Now we both look like terrible human beings.
I was going to go for an iPod with eternal battery life, but maybe my family. I think that's a good.
Well, the pub sounds like a good option, I think. But, yeah, brilliant. Well, okay, let's dive into this week's big question then, if that's all right, everyone. And Amanda, if I could come to you first. We've finally Brexited just over a month ago now. But what does that actually mean? And perhaps could you give us a quick overview of where we are in the whole thing?
Yes, so we have Brexited. So we've legally left the EU on the 31st of January, but nothing much has changed yet, that's true. The reason for that is that we're in this transition period just until the 31st of December this year. And during that time, most things remain the same. Trade arrangements remain the same. The ability to move people around and operate your business as you did before. What is changing now, though, is the level of discussion, negotiations that the EU and UK have entered into. And we're starting to get some much clearer direction as to where we're going to end up. So what we do know is that the UK and EU positions, wherever the negotiations end up, we will end up leaving the customs union and the single market. And we're heading for what I would describe as a much harder Brexit than many people, commentators, businesses expected just a few months ago.
That sounds reassuring. I think for many listeners that sounds a bit frustrating. We've sort of gone through this whole process, and yet actually the big cliff edge is still on the horizon a bit. Is that fair to say?
I think there could be, actually. It depends where the negotiations end up. There at the moment, given the red lines as they're being described and the way they've been drawn between the UK and the EU, there is actually quite some distance until they come together. And there's a very short period of time for those negotiations to be conducted. And if we think about it, it's not only about negotiating the EU trade arrangement for the future, but also all of those other trade negotiations that the UK has opened now formally, including with the US, Australia, Japan. And they are going to take time. They're very detailed. And of course, business needs to track what's going on with this and prepare to be able to accommodate the new trading arrangements. And that's the big thing that is challenging most businesses at the moment.
And Raoul, you spent much of the last 3.5 years, on the negotiating side and trying to get to this point. Could you have imagined us being here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think given the political uncertainty of the past few years, having some kind of clarity is welcome, I think. And, it was being on the inside quite challenging and frustrating at times, not having the clarity or the ability to get done what you needed to get done. I think it was always going to take time to do this, but probably not for the reasons people really expected. I think people thought it would take time because it's complicated. It's a negotiation that's never been done before, and we're unwinding 45 years of sort of interlinkage with the rest of the EU. But the real reason it's taken so long was the lack of political clarity, the lack of, a majority in Parliament. And also, I think people, personally, I was surprised just how divided the country remained post-referendum and how divided our politics remain. So it's taken a long time to get through that. Obviously, with the election, we have some kind of clarity and some kind of way through.
Yeah, breaking heart up is hard to do, isn't it? I think, and I think you sort of, and you go back to a year ago when we were, I think it was the first major deadline, the end of March deadline a year ago, and that got extended, and it got extended again. And is that something which we might see again at the end of the year?
Well, I think it's pretty unlikely. The reason why we had those extensions was ultimately because Parliament forced them upon the government. Look, maybe the government would have done it anyway, but ultimately it didn't have the majority not to extend, and so Parliament was forcing that. Obviously now that has changed. The arithmetic in Parliament has changed, and there's no longer a majority in favour of an extension or against leaving without a deal. And so the government now, with its 80-seat majority, is very clear. It's not going to extend the transition period. It's not going to look to stay closely tied to the EU for any longer than it needs to. All that is already set. And so I think it's very unlikely there's going to be an extension this time around. And I don't think, from my conversations, that either side is actually planning for that. And, we'll see when it comes to the middle of this year when the deadline for the extension is. But I think our advice to all businesses is that you can't bank on that, and it's very unlikely to happen. So you need to start preparing. And that's true for anyone who's going to be affected by this.
So my day job, I work in a consulting practice, and I actually help support some clients prepare to, mainly with suppliers, to ensure that supply was getting into the country if there was a no deal, or depending on what the deal was. And I think the big challenge was clients, that uncertainty, and clients trusting what was actually going to happen next, and that they did need contingency plans. So I was just wondering, Amanda, speaking about the uncertainty of the past, how you experienced that working with our clients. How was that for you?
Well, it was actually quite difficult for a lot of clients, actually, because they were having to make judgment calls on how much to invest in planning, how much to actually prepare their business for a risk that may or may not ever happen. Like any other risk assessment that a business has to make. But for many businesses, this cost a lot of money and it diverted a lot of resources, and they had to do it on more than one occasion, and particularly if, as you mentioned in your example, they were having to manage complex supply chains, and they were very worried about particularly that border between the crossing between Dover and Calais and getting goods across there. That was seen as a particular pinch point. But not only with physical supply chains. I mean, if you look at our services industries, particularly financial services and insurance, they have had to respond to quite strong regulatory requirements to restructure, establish new businesses, effectively dual structures in the UK and the EU now, and capitalise those. And so I think, for many industries across the board, there has been a lot of preparation and investment done to prepare for what was going to be a very disruptive Brexit. I do think there is more time now, actually, in experience to prepare in a more considered and detailed way, and that's what we're starting to see changing now.
Mm-hmm. And as Raoul mentioned, it's unlikely to be another extension, but I guess no deal is still on the table if worst case scenario.
Yeah, it certainly is. I think, the two sides are aiming in broadly the same place for a zero tariff, zero quota FTA, but there are no guarantees. There are some big dividing lines, and any negotiation can go south. So the no deal is still on the table. The one thing I would say is, though, the difference between no deal and the sort of free trade agreement that we're aiming for is not actually huge. And so for a lot of businesses, the planning they've done for no deal is going to be quite valid for the type of scenario we're looking at, even if we do get an FTA. So for example, if you're a manufacturer selling across the border, you're going to have to deal with customs checks, customs compliance, import-export declarations, safety and security declarations. All these things you would have to have dealt with in no deal are going to be needed in a deal scenario as well. So actually what we're seeing this time around is quite a confluence of the planning. You have a set of things that we call known knowns that you can know are going to change and are not really dependent on the negotiation. You can start planning for them now that work in both scenarios. One thing that is a challenge, linking to what Amanda was talking about, is that a lot of businesses feel they have been marched up the hill a bit a few times and have prepared for this, and are wondering if this time is the same. Is there going to be extension or not, etc. But I think it is very different. The fundamental politics and the majorities that we've talked about have changed, and so I think businesses are starting to come round to see the fact that actually it is we have left, and there is very likely not going to be an extension, and so we do have to start preparing. And so it's sort of different to the last few times we've come up to this kind of deadline.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just build on that, Raoul, in terms of it is a bit different because we have got that withdrawal agreement. We do have now some certainty on two of the most important and complex areas of Brexit around people and their security and ability to remain living and working in either the UK or the EU. And also the Northern Ireland border and that security piece. So I think that those two elements were, very concerning for all, and they have actually been now signed up to in that withdrawal agreement. And whatever happens on those future trade negotiations, that withdrawal agreement is effectively a treaty between the UK and the EU. So it remains. So we know what the terms are of that separation to some degree. So it's not quite the same gravity or sort of disruption that we're expecting.
And what are the key pieces of the puzzle which need to be found for the next few months, or as we enter this next transition period?
Well, I mean, there's a huge amount to do in terms of negotiations. There are some big dividing lines where the gaps are quite significant. I think this thing which is known as level playing field, which is basically trying to agree the terms on which we trade. So making sure from the EU's perspective, the UK is not seen to undercut the single market and the customs union, not engage in unfair competition. And what the EU is seeking to do is trying to have the UK align in an ongoing basis on state aid rules, or not regress from the current levels of environmental protection, workers' rights, taxation law, things like that. Whereas the UK is sort of saying, well, this is not what you've done to other countries. We're just looking for a free trade agreement like you have with Canada or Japan, and you don't put these requirements on them, so why are you putting them on us? And that is a pretty big dividing line at the moment, and it's a sort of fundamental principle for the UK the UK government, that they don't want to be tied into these EU laws. They don't want to have the European Court of Justice oversight. And so that's one of the big dividing lines.
And there are some of these nuances here around fisheries and all the rest of it. But I mean, can businesses kind of switch off for a bit while this negotiation happens and then pick it up later in the year, perhaps? Or is it important that they kind of stay up to date with what the day-to-day changes as it progresses? I
think it's important to stay as up to date as possible. I mean, I think, as I said, there are lots of things that you can sort of say are known and are going to change. So I think they should look at what those are, bank those, and start getting on with it, to be honest. And I think the lead times in some of those things are quite long. So you think about a new customs system, reorganising your supply chain to deal with these new checks and compliance requirements. That takes time. can take months, if not longer. So I think a lot of businesses need to start on that now, but they also then need to keep track of the negotiation and see where it's going, because there will be bits that change based on the negotiation, and also there will be some differences between a deal and no deal.
And in particular, just picking up on that time frame point that you mentioned, Raoul, I think if any of us have ever tried to change contracts on a sort of numerous basis, with many contracts to change because perhaps they refer to the EU and we need to now refer to the UK and the EU, it sounds like a small thing, but if you're doing that for thousands of contracts, then that's hugely time consuming. The other thing that takes time are those systems changes. If any of you have ever tried to get anything into an IT program, they're generally set out for months in advance. And so I think being able to even just switch on, change your coding in a particular system does take time. And so those are the things that really need to be started now rather than waiting until the back end of the year. The other thing I just wanted to pick up on, again, on your question of sort of what are the big things that need to be done. And one of the areas that is still unclear is exactly how the arrangements with Northern Ireland are going to work. So we get asked quite often the question about sort of to what extent am I actually going to have to manage any border checks, and is it going to be a good thing to be operating a business out of Northern Ireland? And that is still very unclear. It's something which has got to be agreed with a subcommittee under a joint committee between the EU and the UK, and that is potentially an area for business to have to actually track right now in terms of preparing for the regulatory regime going forward.
Mm-hmm. And when I was preparing for this podcast, my brother-in-law is an animator, and he wanted me to ask about the creative industries, because there's been some news recently about Creative Europe and remaining part of that not being a priority for the UK government. So I guess my question is probably a bit broader than that, but are there any specific industries that you expect to be impacted more than others by Brexit?
Yeah, well, I think you can look at various different sectors that are going to be impacted different ways. So there are the ones with complex supply chains that cross the where products and inputs cross the border a number of times. So automotive is a good example. They import and export parts across the UK EU border numerous times in production, and they bring a lot of different parts into the creation of an engine or whatever in the UK. And so and they often operate just in time supply chains. So putting a new barrier into those supply chains is a huge impact for them, and involves a massive reorganization, and so they'll be heavily affected. I think if you look at the heavily regulated sectors, so I'm thinking things like chemicals and medicines, where you need to go through sort of significant regulatory approvals, they will have a different system. They will have to engage with one in the UK and one in the EU, whereas before they just had to have one approval that covers the whole of the EU. They'll now have two systems they have to engage with, and that's a big change, and that might involve also having to have a presence in the EU where they didn't have one before, and so they'll be quite heavily affected. Then you also have some areas where the step down simply in terms of market access is going to be quite significant. So services, I think, is along the lines of a standard FTA, where actually, they have some provisions, but they're not very comprehensive. And it's a big difference from the sort of single market and services we see. Okay, the single market and services in the EU isn't complete, and there are still barriers, but it is going to be quite a big shift for some services sectors. And then you have things like, you mentioned the creative industries, but, audiovisual, for example, is according to the EU entirely out of the negotiation. They're not even going to negotiate on it. So some things are just completely out of scope, or just won't be able to be done in time, and so will have to be looked at over time. But the default then is for those things that fall outside of that negotiation or don't get prioritized. The default is that you fall back onto international rules or WTO rules in the interim. So there's lots of areas that could have quite big impacts.
I guess funding as well is the other big one. As I mentioned, Creative Europe, I know that provides tens of millions of euros to British companies for different projects. So I guess it's continuation of that funding and where that's going to come from.
Actually, you can scratch the surface, and there are quite a lot of grey areas really when you do go down to these different sort of subsectors and industries and things, and that's a bit of a divergence from Deloitte does a CFO survey which measures confidence on a quarterly basis of UK CFOs, and it found I think it had the biggest ever increase in confidence in its 11-year history when it was conducted in January. So a post-election bounce, that reassurance, that clarity point which Amanda mentioned earlier. So is there a bit of a disconnect between the broader business picture and actually there are probably some people at C-suite level who are a bit more worried than others? Is that fair to say?
I think there is a disconnect. I would agree with you, because actually that confidence point was probably answered on the big question of actually we now have a stable Conservative majority government, and there were many other factors that perhaps that CFO was taking into account. And I think the idea that Brexit is certainly happening, and it's about what form it's going to take. Business wants to know how it needs to adapt. I would just, they will adapt, but they need that certainty of what are the rules, what direction should they go in, and that's where I think there is a potential disconnect.
I was just going to answer that because we sort of talked about preparedness earlier in the conversation. I think that you go back through history, there are often these sort of big macro events, whether it's a millennium bug or a financial crisis, where actually it forces businesses to really reflect on themselves and actually let's shine the mirror at their own operations and work out actually how improvements can be made. So on some level it's an important process to go through, isn't it? I suppose it's a bit like it's a spring cleaning. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a process that businesses need to go through. I think is unlike some of those other shocks you mentioned, this is one that we know is coming and you can foresee. And although you can't predict entirely what it's going to look like, you do know some parts of it, and you can say with some certainty about what things are going to change. So, it's rare that you have sort of what I would characterise probably as an external demand and supply shock to the UK economy that you can sort of see quite far out and prepare for, and businesses can look at in detail. So, in that sense, it is quite unique, and I think it is something that that ability to have some foresight of what's coming is something businesses should try and take advantage of and use the time available. Obviously, as I said, they do need help from government in terms of information and things, but it's an opportunity in some ways to look at what can be done. Are you still doing things as efficiently as possible in the new environment? There are going to be some opportunities as well in terms of, with this new funding, with a looser fiscal policy, with the new approach to the regional policy, with potential new trade agreements, with potential changes in regulation. There's lots of things moving around. And while that creates uncertainty for business, there are also opportunities there.
Yes, I would agree. The opportunity piece we can't overlook. I mean, I think the thing is when a business or an individual, you're faced with a huge amount of change and disruption coming your way, you are just looking at how to immediately deal with that. And you don't necessarily have the ability to lift your head up and look at what it might look like in the future and how you might influence that. And, fair enough, many businesses have spent decades building up very, very efficient and effective just-in-time supply chains that exactly work to the minute and shave off milliseconds of time in production. And for those to be disrupted is obviously going to cost time and money and make things less effective for a while. But I do agree, this sort of stepping back and looking, well, actually, if you could redesign it, what would it look like, is giving sort of some businesses that thought to say, yeah, I know we've always done it this way, but what if we did it in a slightly different way? And I think just picking up as well on that word opportunity, this government is saying that they want to incentivise investment. They want to see that foreign direct investment coming back into the UK, which has been sort of suspended or diverted for a few years with the Brexit uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. And so today we're joined by two distinguished guests who were really in quite an exclusive position on a once in a generation event. So I guess we need to hear a little bit about your personal experience. So I guess, Raoul, what was it like being on the front line of those negotiations?
Absolutely exhausting, personally, but yeah, huge privilege and incredibly interesting, and I think not like anything I'd done before, and it was at times hugely frustrating as well, because when you don't have a political majority, you have to try and build coalitions, and that is an interesting learning experience, but also as we saw, didn't end up coming off, so we weren't able to get a deal over the line under the Theresa May government. But it's quite a unique experience and a unique point in history, I guess, to be in number 10 in government. So it was certainly hugely interesting and a huge privilege.
And were there any particularly significant or unexpected moments that you can recall?
I mean, all the votes in Parliament were sort of sitting there, sometimes being able to sit in what's known as the box in the side of the Commons to watch the debate and be there for that and for the votes, or sitting in the PM's office in the Commons, watching and waiting to see the result of the vote, and being there with most of the cabinet and things like that. These are huge things that you get to experience, and so that's sort of something you never quite expect or never really think about. But being there is an interesting experience, although when you lose the vote, quite a crushing one as well. But it's definitely something that you'll remember for the rest of your life, I expect.
And Amanda, how is it from you from the business side and being in those boardrooms and those kind of experiences?
It's certainly not a title I expected to have in my career on my CV, but it's been hugely rewarding and challenging at the same time. I mean, some of those conversations are extremely difficult, sometimes very stressful. You're having to absorb huge amounts of information, actually, but on so many it's so diverse, isn't it, Brexit? You can't possibly be an expert on all aspects, but being required to know a bit about everything that's going on has been a great experience, actually. A lot of responsibility coming with that as well, of course. It's been quite politically sensitive, and I have to say I was never really that into politics. I kind of watched it, but then you become really drawn into the whole parliamentary process and having to understand actually how the Commons works, and so that was something very new for me, and it's been extremely interesting so far. And I do think we're just at the start though in terms of how business is going to adapt going forward.
And I mean, you had that in an incredibly detailed way, but I feel like almost the whole country had that in some respect, like parliamentary processes that I had no idea how it worked, and I found myself watching votes and all of that stuff. So I guess that's political engagement might be one thing that comes from Brexit.
Well, my daughter's 5 this summer, and she often talks about what she wants to be when she grows up, and she wants to be an animal doctor at the moment, which is fine. But I mean, Global Brexit Lead for a professional services firm might be a next step. Maybe I would encourage her on that one. And I think one of the big findings of the recent election was this the regional debate, really. And perhaps Amanda, could you chat about some of the differences which different regions across the UK might feel? I think we're an unusual country with the Northern Ireland situation, with different sort of with Wales and Scotland as well having a say on things. Perhaps you can chat around how Brexit may impact different areas of the country.
Again, I think that the impact will depend on sort of what the big output is, or what the big job-creating industries are in those regions. So, for some, although fishing is actually a relatively small part of our economy, for that local area, it may be of a huge impact. So for them, it actually is extremely important where we end up on fishing, not only in terms of how the rights work out, but how they're going to be able to get their fish into market, because much of our fish is actually sold into the EU. So we need to make sure we've still got those corridors. Obviously, if you're heavily dependent on automotive manufacturing, then sort of the longevity of those plants, how they might actually morph into something else. The electric car and battery is something which we've heard that there'll be a lot of investment into. I think one of the other things for regions in terms of, again, going into the opportunities and what it might look like in the future is to focus on the consultation that's going on at the moment in government on free ports. And this is actually quite an interesting potential area of investment for business and individuals to track, actually, because it's not just about creating a sort of customs-free processing zone. There are other aspects to it that the government is trying to bring in, such as in these areas, making sure that there is different or more relaxed planning rules. You you might be able to bring people in and out in terms of sort of migration and employment a bit more easily than other areas of the country, so that there are sort of a number of areas that have been identified as in places in the United Kingdom which they could develop these. So I would say definitely look for those and try and input into and influence those areas.
And we're in a bit of an echo chamber anyway, I think. But what's your perspective of what other countries think of Brexit? Do they care? Is it sort of off their radar now entirely? Or?
I'd say there's probably two factors influencing how engaged those countries are, or businesses in those countries. One is proximity. So the closer you are to the UK and you've got that immediate border, even if it's divided by the sea, is definitely a factor of engagement. And the second is probably the level to which the economies are intertwined. So if you look at UK and Ireland, we have a very, very close relationship. I mean, many businesses operate as sort of UK and Ireland opco, for instance. So, and we've got the common travel area, that there are, those sort of factors are influencing how engaged both that government and businesses in that country are in terms of what Brexit's going to mean for them.
So we hear a lot about the impact of Brexit on businesses. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on what the impact would be from an individual perspective. So how might it affect our daily lives? Will we feel it in our personal finances? And will we have to queue longer in airports?
Well, I mean, a lot of this depends on exactly what happens. I mean, look, there will obviously be knock-on impacts on the economy, and from these changes, there's lots of questions about exactly how that will look and whether you believe the economic modelling or not, and that kind of thing. But I think the basic fact is you put trade barriers in place that weren't there before, there will be some disruption to business, and that will have knock-on impacts on people's lives. In terms of the practicalities, stuff like travelling, I mean, at the moment, nothing changes. We're in a transition period, so you continue to use the same airport queues. What happens afterwards, I think, depends a bit on the negotiation. You'd hope they could reach an agreement that would allow that to continue and us to be treated like other countries. But I think if you end free movement of people, they may want to make a statement and say, you're going to be in a different queue because you're not going to have continued free movement of people, and so that could change. For those people who like to travel with their pets, you'll no longer be able to use the EU pet passport. So if you want to travel with your pets, you're going to have to plan more. Yeah, so there are going to be impacts there. So those are the kind of things that will change people's lives, I guess.
Obviously, there's emotional support ducks and things travelling around in America. Sorry.
I have to say, I've never actually travelled with my pet, and I feel I've lost out on the opportunity now. But anyway, I agree. I think that the here and now isn't going to change very much, but it's really interesting to project forward into the future. I've got 4 kids, and I think one of them at the moment is enjoying a gap year, able to just turn up and live and work in another country in the EU. The other 3, I think life's going to be a bit different in terms of choices for them, and so there is actually a impact in the future, and we don't actually know what the position's going to be yet, as Raoul says, so we have to see how that pans out.
Yeah. Well, Raoul, Amanda, thank you so much for coming today to educate us and our listeners about this bit of a knotty question, really. But, from everything we've talked about today, it sounds like we're not quite there yet. But perhaps I can ask, can we finally stop talking about Brexit?
I think evidenced by the fact we just spent almost an hour talking about it, probably not. No, I think, look, the reality is this is going to drag on for a while, certainly for this year. But I think the aim from both sides actually is to have a relationship that you get something done this year and you build on it over time. So while it might not be called Brexit anymore and, it might evolve, there is going to be an ongoing discussion about our relationship with the EU. And that's not something that's not going to go away even at the end of this year. I think that will continue for some time to come.
I'd say the politics of Brexit is receding, but the business conversation is just getting started.
Fantastic. On that note, Raoul and Amanda, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We'll be back next time with another big question. This podcast is produced by our very own pod squad and hosted by George Parrett, Lizzie Elston and Ethan Worth. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett from our consulting team.